If the Eaton affair had an air of melodrama, it was also a sign that tragedy was waiting in the wings. Vice President John C. Calhoun, whose wife had battled Jackson over Peggy Eaton, was simultaneously involved in another crisis, one that threatened to bring the nation to civil war.
John C. Calhoun, from about 1830 on, was obsessed for the remainder of his life with one fundamental problem. And that was the problem of protecting slavery in a nation where slaveholders were becoming a minority. How could slavery be perpetuated in the face of an indifferent or even hostile North?
The crisis was triggered not by slavery, but taxes. Congress, eager to protect northern factories, had passed a law which imposed a high tax on the cheap imported cloth used by southern plantation owners to clothe their slaves. Determined to eliminate the tax and protect slavery, Calhoun began promoting nullification, under which every state had the right to disregard, within its borders, any law it considered unconstitutional.
Nullification appealed to Calhoun and other South Carolinians because it was a way of asserting states' rights. And clearly that was a fundamental threat to the entire idea of a federal system. And it went straight to the heart of the fundamental American question of who was sovereign. Was the federal government sovereign? Were the states sovereign? Were the people sovereign? These were all incredibly complicated questions that consumed the Jackson White House and Jackson's Washington.
Nullification's fiercest supporters were congressmen from South Carolina. Its bitterest opponents were northern congressmen who were convinced it would lead to the breakup of the Union. And then there were those whose positions were unknown, including President Andrew Jackson. On April 13, 1830, all three factions were represented at a dinner in Washington, D.C. in honor of Thomas Jefferson's birthday. John C. Calhoun and the nullifiers had been plotting for months to use the event to convert those sitting on the fence to their cause. And in their eyes, Jackson, a fellow slave owner, was a natural ally. But Andrew Jackson had his own plans for the dinner. And as he arrived, he felt the same thrill he had always felt before a battle. As the evening began, the nullifiers endeavored to build support by making toast after toast to the importance of states' rights. Then suddenly, President Jackson raised his glass. Looking John C. Calhoun straight in the eye, he made his toast.
Our federal union, it must be preserved.
Those 7 words sent shockwaves through Washington, for all now knew where Andrew Jackson stood. He would not tear apart the nation he had helped build. For Vice President Calhoun, Jackson's opposition to nullification was intolerable. The two men soon stopped speaking. Then, in November of 1832, the state of South Carolina formally nullified the tax and added that if the federal government challenged its right to do so, South Carolina would withdraw from the Union.
It's hard for us to understand how serious nullification was. It nearly led to civil war. Troops in South Carolina were marching. Jackson himself wanted to lead the federal army into South Carolina. They were fortifying forts in Charleston Harbor. This was very close to an all-out civil war, and it was Andrew Jackson's duty to stop that.
Instead of reacting in anger, as he had so often before, Jackson issued a presidential proclamation in which he appealed to the people of South Carolina.
Seduced as you have been, my fellow countrymen, by ambitious, deluded, and designing men, I call upon you in the language of truth and with the feelings of a father to retrace your steps. Say, we too are citizens of America. Carolina is one of these proud states. Her best blood has cemented this happy union. And then add, if you can, without horror and remorse, this happy union we will dissolve. This picture of peace and prosperity we will deface. These fertile fields we will deluge with blood. Disunion by armed force is treason. Are you ready to incur its guilt?
And that's when he said, the union is perpetual. It is not a union of states, it is a union of people. And once you're in that union, you can't get out. And I, as the chief executive, have sworn to enforce the laws. Both those ideas are adopted by Abraham Lincoln in his inaugural. The whole thing is set up by Jackson.
With both sides preparing for civil war, the most skilled negotiator in Congress, Henry Clay, succeeded in winning passage of a compromise bill that dramatically lowered the tariff. Jackson signed it, South Carolina agreed to abide by it, and war was averted. For Andrew Jackson, the story of nullification contained a dire warning. If Americans kept arguing about slavery, a civil war was inevitable. And so the president began appealing to Northerners to stop agitating against slavery. But that was not what the abolition movement had in mind. In 1835, the New York abolitionist Lewis and Arthur Tappan realized that the steam-powered printing press made something brand new in American politics possible: a mass mailing. And so they sent pamphlets to thousands of influential people in the South, such as ministers, to try and convince them to speak out against slavery. The first batch of pamphlets arrived in Charleston, South Carolina. But the postmaster never delivered them to the addressees. Instead, they were taken to the town square and burned.
Jackson and the Jacksonians' paranoia about slavery, as is seen in this whole incident about abolitionist literature being sent into the South, like all paranoia, has some foundation in reality. Their fear is that the word would get out to the slave population and would incite slaves to revolt. And this is a concern that they all have in this period, particularly as you get into the early 1830s in the wake of the Nat Turner Rebellion. Anytime rebellions have taken place, slaveholders become increasingly paranoid, and the instinct is to squash the articulation of these sorts of expressions as quickly as is possible.
Tampering with the mail was a serious federal crime. But President Jackson tacitly encouraged postmasters to destroy the pamphlets. And he demanded that Congress outlaw mailing them, saying they were incendiary.
The Tappan flyers provide an interesting insight into what we could say is the Jacksonians' view of democracy, because of all things, the ability to petition, the ability to get word out about your position is a fundamental tenet of all democratic societies. So in that sense, then, Jackson and his people are attempting to squash a clear democratic voice in this period.
Elias Boudinot, the Cherokee Nation. What sort of hope have we from a president who has an inclination to disregard laws and treaties? We have nothing to expect from such a president.